Story 1. The Tower. Kira pulled into the parking lot of the campground and was surprised to see that it was nearly full. F-150s with boat trailers and obnoxious RVs filled multiple spots, completely disregarding other campers. She sighed. "The one weekend I get off and everyone decides to go camping here," she whispered to herself. She drove by the packed rows frustrated, nearly ready to leave, but as luck would have it, a small single spot revealed itself to her. She waited, ever so briefly, and weighed her options. "I should just go back home. I don't even like camping," she told herself. However, a car behind her honked, interrupting her small moment of reflection, and she pulled into the spot. She got out of the car and grabbed her large backpack she had packed, and went to the mouth of the trail. The nearby lake was slightly less full, but people lined most of the nearby lakeshore, and a few dozen watercrafts were out enjoying their day. Oh, how Kira wished she could be out there with friends, out in the sun and in the cool water, enjoying her time, perhaps drinking and gossiping about work or about boys, but that wasn't the case for her. She had lived mostly a sheltered life, never taking a risk, never acting on a desire outside of her control. She was a loner, but not by choice. Her anxiety and depression had a firm grip on her, one that she felt that she would never be released from. She proceeded to the trail and glanced to both sides of her, both being filled with colorful tents and camping chairs lining fire pits. The woods were bright and full of people, out playing various types of yard games. Each campsite seemed full. She continued her way down to the end of the trail, where thick woods seemed to provide a barrier from the joyful campsites in the bleak woods beyond. She glanced back one last time, and much like her life, there was no room for her here amongst the happy people. She wanted to cut her losses and just head back home, but she remembered that her therapist promised that if she did something outside of her comfort zone, that she'd begin to grow. She pressed forward through the woods, still able to hear the commotion of the other campers near the trail. Ahead of her was a similar view of land, but much more cleared out. Although talking to normal people in everyday situations was really hard for her, she loved the lonesomeness that the woods provided, nighttime especially. The darkness seemed to call to her. She secretly longed for it, the blackness of the void to cover her and erase her from this painful world. The worn trail seemed to be less maintained the further she went into the woods. The twists and turns made it feel like this path went on forever. Instead of just camping off the trail, an idea had crept into her mind. What lies beyond, she thought. Just further down into the woods, perhaps, was the perfect spot for seclusion, a nice dark little nook just for her. What she lacked in social ability, she made up for in curiosity. Maybe just out of earshot of the other campers, she thought, as she hiked into the darker recesses of the woods. The untouched portion of the woods was less appealing to the eye, but much more gratifying overall. This was real nature, not the ideal construct of what people tend to make it out to be, but the real unfiltered nature that she so desperately needed. Time didn't seem to affect her, as she eventually found herself a good ways in, beyond the sight or sound of anyone else. She began to set up her one main tent by clearing the litter of leaves out of the area. The uneven ground provided to be difficult, but once the tent was fully erect, it didn't seem to matter. Once the site was fully up, she realized that there was much more daylight left to just simply sit in her tent. The idea to walk back over to the overpopulated campsites and try to make friends seemed troublesome, but taking a reflective hike deeper into the woods was far more appealing. She set her stuff down and didn't bother taking her phone. She only brought her half-full hydro flask and a small jacket, just on the off chance that the weather decided to take a turn for the worst. She made sure to keep a mental note of where she was going, as to not get lost in the unfamiliar woods alone. But she wasn't terribly worried. Despite her being tucked away in the portion of unmarked woods, she quickly was able to find an old trail that led deeper into the forest. The path was unkempt, almost unrecognizable had she not been looking for it, but now that she was on it, it was almost impossible to miss. She placed a single earbud in and played an audiobook while also keeping an ear out for nature. Normally, she would indulge herself with an additional substance like shrooms or THC, but seeing how she was alone in the forest that she was unfamiliar with, she decided to hold off until after her hike. About an hour into the hike, she began to realize that the atmosphere she had seen earlier was nearly opposite. The lively chatter of nearby campers was replaced by an unsettling silence. Birds and small insects had ceased their noise. The overall vibe matched that of a cemetery. However, this was exactly the kind of peace she was looking for, but not to this degree. Silence was always welcome to her, but this was something else. She looked around and removed her earbud to better ground herself in where she was. Trees surrounded the trail, but up ahead, a couple hundred yards or so, a small clearing indicated something of value may be there. The walk to the clearing was much more different than the entirety of the hike. Fear, perhaps stumbling upon someone's remote cabin, crept in the back of her mind. She had heard her fair share of horror stories of hermits occupying remote cabins to make drugs or to perform ungodly acts away from society. However, this all dissipated almost instantly once she reached the mouth of the clearing. Sitting in the open field, perhaps 100 feet in the air or so, was a gargantuan structure. The metal frame and its supports were old and rusted, but still seemed to support the small viewing station sitting on top. Kira racked her brain for a few moments, but quickly realized that this was a fire tower. There were no signs posted at the base of the stairs, and no indicators of restricted access. She quickly walked over and examined the stairs leading up. She listened briefly, but the overwhelming silence persisted. The option to turn back at this point was going to have to wait. Kira had been able to follow the old trail to a hidden treasure tucked away into the woods, all for herself to examine. She began up the stairs, excited to see what wonders she would be able to see from the new perspective that she was able to find. An unobscure view of the lake was most likely an option. Her excitement was beginning to cloud her judgment. She speedily ascended the stairs, not worrying about the potential dangers of going inside an old structure. The tower creaked slowly as its frame moved slightly in the wind. Her footsteps sounded up the tower with excitement, filling in the silence of the forest nearby. Unaware of her pace, she ended up stopping about 3/4 of the way to catch her breath. Her legs began to burn slightly, as the hour hike, plus the rigorous stairs, began to take their toll. Looking out from the staircase, she could already see above the tree line. Far stretches of green met her gaze as she drank in all that nature had to offer. She prepped herself for the last 4 flights or so before she was able to reach the top. Her hike was going to be much slower, but she didn't mind. Before she started up the stairs again, the excitement of the fire tower was beginning to diminish. She was now more aware. She bent down and tightened both shoes and noticed that the stairs, mixed in with their rust, were also dried stains. Surely this could have been mud or tracks of other people, but the thought crept in her mind. Once the realization hit, she listened, not just for the enjoyment of nature, but to try to see if there was something else nearby. Again, the silence was far too heavy, but now she was actively conscious. She continued, but much slower this time. For some bizarre reason, her anxiety, the one thing that she was trying to escape from, had returned. Her brain was on high alert. It was telling her that something was wrong, but it had yet any reason nor proof to convince her to decline the view from the top. Her mind would soon be validated, as the pressing silence she endured for the last 20 minutes or so began to leave. A mysterious sound began to emanate from above, a soft and rhythmic humming seeming to be coming from the tower. Her mind was still aware, but the sound was so bizarre that curiosity replaced her anxiety. At first, the sound gave her the brief impression that this could have been the hooting of an owl, but that theory was quickly thrown out the closer she reached the top. The low humming began to reveal itself as the melancholy sounds of sobbing. Someone was here, out in the middle of nowhere, standing in this tower, and they were sobbing. Something wasn't right. Kira now stood 2 flights of stairs away from reaching the top, but that was no longer appealing. Her breathing began to get heavy, as she was now concerned of alerting whoever this disturbed person was of her presence. Thankfully, the winds at this height gave her a slight cushion as they covered most of the sounds. Kira glanced at the stairs and noticed that more stains smeared across the walkway. However, these were far more fresh. Some of the stairs still dripped a thick, dark liquid, indicating that something was probably dragged up here. After seeing the stains, Kira gasped. Once she did, the sobbing from above suddenly stopped. The wind had betrayed her, as it now held its gust and silence once again filled the air. She stepped backwards, hoping that whoever was above was oblivious to her presence. Motion could be heard from above, and Kira now knew that this was time to get out of there. She ran down the stairs as quickly as her body would allow. She didn't bother with sound at this point, as speed was her main concern. An ear-piercing scream came from above, which sent chills down her spine. Had she not already been moving, she would have most likely been petrified in place. She quickly reached the bottom of the stairs and knew better than to look back. She knew if she did that she would have seen something that she wouldn't have liked. Kira struggled to find the old trail leading back to her camp, but fate would again be back on her side. She eventually found it. Thankfully, a quick glance behind her, while a good portion down the trail confirmed that she was not being followed. A sigh of relief began to wash over her. She began to calm down as she began to get closer back to her camp. Before she reached her camp, she saw a peculiar sight standing in the middle of the trail. Sitting ahead of her was a park ranger mounted on an old horse. He wore a uniform and badge, including the iconic hat. He appeared to be old and not aware of her presence. She caught him off guard as she said hello as she approached. "Whoa, what are you doing out here?" he said, legitimately surprised. "Sorry, I'm just out for a hike," she said. His old crusty gaze peered over her in a disapproving way. "You shouldn't be out here. You need to stay on the posted trail so you don't get lost." Kira nodded. "Okay, I can do that," she said politely. "I ought to write you a ticket, but I don't have a pen. Next time you won't be so lucky." Kira nodded. "Oh, by the way, there's someone crying in the fire tower at the end of the trail," Kira mentioned as she passed the ranger on the trail. The ranger had a bizarre look on his face. "You been to the fire tower?" he said, legitimately confused. She stopped. "I didn't go inside, but I could hear someone crying from outside." The ranger was silent, as he was clearly contemplating this new information. "Alright, well, no one's supposed to be out there, but I'll go take a quick look." Kira noticed that the ranger had a rifle tucked into his saddle, as well as a pistol holstered in his belt. The two went separate ways, and Kira was slightly frustrated. She made her way back to camp and could hear the noise again of the other joyful campers. The atmosphere had shifted again, but this time for the positive. The warm sun soon began to set, as brilliant oranges and pinks would fill the sky. Kira debated on moving her camp closer to the others, but felt that it would be too much work, especially as it was getting dark. Nighttime eventually came, and her strange encounter out in the woods had faded from her mind. She got a small fire going and began eating what food she had brought as she relaxed under the stars. Kira called it an early night and put out her fire, as well as making sure that she got bits of trash and food out of the way so that critters wouldn't get into them. Her hike had taken its toll on her, and she drifted off quickly into her sleeping bag. As soft and sweet as her dreams were, they didn't last long. Kira was awoken several hours later. The sound of something heavy moving outside of her tent had jolted her awake. Something large could be heard moving outside as she slowly began to panic at her newfound situation. However, it didn't take her long to recognize the familiar sounds as she poked her head out from the tent. She shined her light on the familiar horse she had seen earlier that day. The horse was walking with a limp, and its rider, the grouchy old ranger, was nowhere to be seen. She got out of the tent and went to inspect the large animal and saw that both the horse and the saddle had several scratches on it. The horse was slightly shaking, but enjoyed her embrace. "What happened to you?" she said, as she gently rubbed the horse. Surprisingly enough, the saddle still had its rifle on it. She racked her mind for what could possibly have happened, but she was unsure. Maybe a bear attack or even a cougar could have done this. The horse then began to walk away, but back out into the trail leading back to the fire tower. She couldn't just let the horse go, not after what she had seen. The horse would then stop and wait as she slowly began to follow behind her with her flashlight. She then realized that the horse was leading her somewhere, most likely to the scene of the incident. After seeing what the horse was doing, she grabbed the rifle from the saddle and continued to follow. Her light shook as they walked side by side, unsure of what they were about to see. The old trail was much different at night. Darkness seemed to fill all parts of the path, save it be the small area in which the flashlight shined. The only thing that was the same was that eerie silence. Shadows casted from branches and tree limbs gave off terrible portraits of potential monsters lurking off into the woods. Kira tried her best to stay focused and to not be so jumpy. After a long walk deeper into the woods, the horse had finally stopped. Kira shined her light around, hoping for anything to explain what was going on, but was only left with more questions. Her light eventually landed briefly on a figure, laying face down on the ground. The familiar uniform revealed to her ahead of time of who it most likely was. She walked over quietly and took the rifle off of her shoulder. Her light revealed small portions of blood and torn clothing laying around the lifeless body. She bent down and nudged it softly to find that it was firm and cold. She turned it over to confirm that it was indeed the old ranger from before. His torso had several scratches running across, but the bizarre thing about it was his face. A look of horror still held on his face as his mouth hung open. His jaw was broken and made his expression even more extreme. Red stains smeared across his beard and neck as more scratches could be found. It was his eyes that startled Kira. Instead of his eyes having a pupil or even being removed altogether, his eyes were even more terrifying. A milky white color seemed to fill the entire eyeball. No traces of color could be found. Kira gasped in horror as something inexplicable had clearly occurred here. She tried to move his body, but he was far too heavy. Kira quickly turned back to the horse. "I can't move him. We need more help," she whispered to the horse. Kira put the rifle on her back and tried to pull the horse along, but it wouldn't budge. The horse was loyal to its owner, even though he had clearly passed. She quickly made her way back to her tent, where she tried calling for the police. Of course, she couldn't get a connection in the woods, so she had to quickly make her way out into the parking lot. Once she called the police, they gave her an estimate on when they should expect the two officers to arrive. Kira waited in her car for 45 minutes before they showed up. It was about 2 a.m. The police arrived with the lights on, but no siren. Kira met them but made sure to leave the ranger's rifle in the car. "I'm the one that called about the body," she said frantically as she approached the two officers. "Let's try to calm our voices down. We don't want to alarm the other campers," he said in a hushed tone. "I should also mention that I found his rifle out in the woods. I grabbed it to make sure no one else did anything stupid with it." She pointed to her car. The second officer peered inside. "I'm gonna grab this as evidence," he said, but instead of putting the rifle in the police cruiser, he slung it on his shoulder. "Okay, show us where the body is." Kira led the two officers out into the woods. They found the small trail and followed it while doing their best to be quiet. All three of them had flashlights and shined them in different directions as they quietly ventured to the scene. Once they arrived where Kira had left the body, a shocking discovery was made. The horse that was determined to stay there was still there, but was no longer in one piece. Its body was absolutely destroyed, and aside from its head, no other part of it was recognizable. The body of the ranger, however, was no longer there. "This is where the body was," Kira whispered. Both of the officers were silent as they scanned the woods around them. One of the officers then shushed Kira as they listened intently. The same stillness of the forest hung quietly, but a familiar sound could be heard down the trail, the sound of crying. The two officers then looked at one another and proceeded to go towards the noise. "Wait," Kira whispered. "Something's not right about this." The second officer removed the rifle from his shoulder. "It's clear that someone's under stress and we need to look into this." Kira then followed them, but made sure to stay behind just on the off chance that something bad would happen. The three eventually reached the source of the sound, and to everyone's surprise, just sitting off the main trail was a tall man. He was slightly hunched over and facing a tree. His forearms were covered in a dark liquid, but that's not what concerned them. The tall figure was bald, but he was also completely naked. His lanky arms looked brittle as its hands and feet were too large. "Sir, is everything okay?" the first officer said while slowly drawing his pistol. The figure then stopped crying as we all stood there in silence, as he didn't respond. Tension began to build as both officers slowly got closer to the mysterious figure. "Sir, I'm gonna need you to turn around." Again, no response. Kira had backed up at this point. Before both officers could issue a final warning, the figure slowly turned to reveal a horrifying face. Blood ran from its teeth-filled mouth, and milky white eyes stared at the officers as it faced them. The face of the creature had no exterior nose, but a hole in its head. The officers were stunned as the creature sprinted off into the woods at an alarming speed. They had clearly come across something that they didn't have a rational explanation for. The three silently agreed that the best option was to get out of there quickly. Their pace was quickened by the thought of that thing returning. Once back at the main campgrounds, both officers quickly got in their cruisers while alerting no one about the situation. "Whatever it was that we saw out there, it's beyond our ability to assist," the second officer said before driving off. Kira sat in the dark parking lot as the taillights slowly faded off into the distance. Story 2: Hunt of the Mimics. Written by Angelic Twigz. Those monsters, those things, they hunt in packs, always watching, waiting, luring prey with those orbs in their heads, like anglerfish in the sea, lurking in the darkness for cover. I never thought I'd encounter anything like it. I never believed in those tall tales of people encountering monsters, demons, hags, and wraiths. Bigfoot or Nessie are good examples. Ghost encounters, demonic rituals, angels, hell, even skinwalkers gave me nothing but chills. All were just myths to me. Tall tales. Parents trying to scare their kids into obedience, or campfire stories to frighten friends and family. Perhaps they're from people who are trying to make sense of things in the world, or so I thought. Now I'm questioning everything. Lies and truths, they all blur together. What is real and what is fake are so hard to tell apart these days. Ever since I met those things, I carry the burden of trauma and fear. I feel like I'm going insane. Those things I keep mentioning, I just started to refer to them as mimics. You'll see why. Let me tell you a tall tale of my own, or at least I wish to tell you that it's just a tall tale. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel to the beat of the song that played from my phone, hooked to my car via Bluetooth. It was surprisingly catchy and upbeat for a dark night, alone in the woods. Any sane person would have just slept over at their grandmother's house this late after visiting, but whoever said I made responsible, insane choices? I bobbed my head along to the song and watched as trees pass by. The silhouettes of evergreens loomed above my little rickety car. It was nothing but an old, well-used cherry-red Chevy Impala. It rattled and complained as I drove down the windy dirt trail that led out of the woods and back to civilization. So far it was perfect and peaceful. The stars studded the night sky. The moon was shining down on the deep green and quiet forest. My car was barely holding together. I had good music on, and I was trying my best not to fall asleep at the wheel. Overall, it was rather good. I bit my lip every now and then just to keep me awake. I worked a 9-to-5 job as a receptionist at a 5-star hotel. Staying up late was nothing new to me.
Biting my lips or fingers were typically how I kept myself awake. But sometimes I bit myself too hard that I bled. This was one of those times. I kept chewing and chewing on my lip until the warm metallic liquid of my blood flowed into my mouth. The pain was dull and didn't really work on keeping me awake anymore. I lifted my right hand quickly and bit my wrist, leaving teeth marks behind as my eyes opened a little more. The pain woke me up. As I was driving, I felt a strange tingling sensation in my head, like someone was tickling my brain. It made me anxious. Maybe it was just exhaustion taking its toll on me. I blinked inside while driving through the woods, glancing at my phone. I checked the battery. 36%, I mumbled to myself. I stopped the music and shut off my phone, plugged it in so it could charge. If anything went wrong, I wanted a way to contact someone. And then I checked my phone once more, letting out a shaky sigh. I tapped my steering wheel. No signal. Still alone with my thoughts and now without music, my mind raced with anxious scenarios. One of them came true. A deer darted out in front of my rickety Impala. Not wanting to hit it, I swerved and slammed on the brakes. The clanking and pinging sound of rocks and twigs hitting my sweet little Impala filled my ears, as the tires lost traction and skidded across the pine needles and dirt. I shrieked and held up my arms to protect my face, bracing myself as my car flipped and tumbled down a hill. My heart raced and pounded in my throat and head, sending shockwaves of adrenaline throughout my body. A cold and sharp feeling of fear clawed and ripped at my nerves as the rolling car bounced and tossed my already exhausted body around. Metal crumpled and creaked, while glass shattered and attacked my skin and threatened to strike my eyes. My Impala slammed into a tree, stopping the continuous tumbling and jerking me around like an old, worn-down ragdoll. I took shaky breaths. I was full of adrenaline and very much awake. I collected my phone and an 8-inch switchblade before I began to work my way out of the destroyed vehicle and into the cool night air. Mustering all the strength I had left in my battered and bleeding body, I kicked the door open and hauled myself through the dirt and pine needles. My little Impala was lying flat on its roof and smoking from the front. It was dented, broken, and no longer barely holding together. I heaved shallow and unsteady breaths as I sat on the forest floor, staring at my totaled car. Eventually, the natural painkiller that the adrenaline was subsided, and pain kicked in, snapping me out of the state of dazed shock. My legs felt numb and stiff. I didn't want to stand. I wanted to sit here and wait out the night till help arrived, but help would never come unless I sought it out. Alone in the woods at night was a dangerous situation in itself, but being injured and alone in the woods at night was a completely different level of danger. The smell of my blood could potentially attract unwanted things to me. Sitting here was just asking for something bad to happen, and that made my anxiety spike, as if it wasn't high enough already. First things first was to find a hotspot where I could call for rescue and wait until it arrived. I slowly shifted to crawling on my hands and knees and dug around in my car. I pulled out my messenger bag and opened the glove box, finally taking notes of the cuts on my arms and hands, along with the blood that trickled down and smudged everything I touched. I shoved a handful of 5 glow sticks in my bag and grabbed a flashlight. I flicked it on and off. Nothing. The battery was dead. I grunted in frustration and tossed the useless flashlight into the back seat, to the annoyance of my arm. I backed out of the car slowly, being careful of the glass shards scattered about. My hands were already bleeding and in pain. I didn't need any more cuts and bruises. I slowly stood up, stumbling to my feet, and used the wrecked car as support while I caught my bearings. My legs just felt stiff and shaky, unsteady if you will. Not much pain down there. I took a deep breath and straightened up slowly as I pulled out a glow stick and snapped it, shaking it until the chemicals inside were mixed together. I began my trek to the bridge that led to the paved road down the mountain. That's where the nearest hotspot was. The silver moon was mostly covered by the wisps of clouds. It made me uneasy because now it was darker. A light breeze caressed the evergreens in my battered body. It made my injuries more pronounced. I had no first aid kit, so all I could do was just hope the smell of my blood didn't attract anything unwanted. Whether that be wolves, bears, or mosquitoes, I felt like I was being watched, like every one of my steps being judged. I felt hopeless. I was alone, cold, helpless, injured, and lost. The perfect prey for any predator who caught a whiff of my scent and decided that they needed a midnight snack. The breeze gently pushed me along as I stumbled around in the dark, following the dirt trail to my safety. My uneven steps quickened as I felt the need to get out of here. I felt followed. I felt hunted. I felt like danger lurked around every corner and hid in every shadow. My breath kept snagging in my throat for a few seconds before I released it and held it again, while stumbling through the dark with my only light source, a measly green glow stick. The moon was unreliable, thanks to the winds pushing the clouds in front of it, but at least I had something to see in the dark with. I refused to pull out my phone. I needed to save the battery on it. It was my ticket out, and I had to make sure not to lose it. Rustling sounds in the bushes caught my attention. I stopped walking and raised my glow stick higher to see my surroundings more clearly. My eyes scanned the area repeatedly for danger as my heart thumped in my chest. I looked over it thoroughly, but I didn't see anything in the dark besides shrubs, ferns, and trees. I shook my head and ruled it as my heightened nerves or some passing by critter. So I kept moving. I needed to keep moving. I doubted I would get attacked, but that didn't mean I couldn't. It felt as though the atmosphere just kept getting darker and colder. Those uneasy feelings seemed to only grow worse. My nerves tingled and spiraled beyond my control. This made me feel queasy. Low chittering growls came from the trees. The bushes and branches rustled, yet nothing could be seen. My blood froze as I realized my gut was feeling right. I was being hunted. My instincts told me to run, but my brain told me otherwise. I couldn't stop. If I did that, I'd be a sitting duck, but running would make them chase me. So despite how everything in my body battled over what I should do, I kept walking. The growling and chittering and hissing kept following me as I traversed the dirt path. And then, a glowing orb flickered to life in the darkness. It floated a few feet above the ground and swayed slightly. A bright yellow light, and then another, and another, until there were 4 glowing orbs around me. 3 were blue, the first orb was yellow. "Iris," came a whisper from one of the orbs. It sounded like Mom. "Iris, follow us," came another voice. It sounded like my best friend, Vivian. The orbs floated around me as they whispered my name and beckoned me. "Iris, it's okay. Just follow us," came another voice. My dad's voice. I was intrigued, suspicious, and frightened. All of these voices were people close to me. Mom, Dad, and my twin brother Keegan, and Viv. The orbs moved closer as I stood there, watching with a flurry of emotion swirling inside of me, like a tornado that didn't know which direction to go. But I was curious about what they were doing here, and why they wanted me to follow them. I reached out to touch the yellow one, curious about it. The yellow orb that sounded like my mom lowered so I could touch it. But the orb lowered and revealed it. And the light was the face of some sort of monster. It just looked like an oversized bird with a large pale yellow beak, filled with rows of sharp, jagged yellow teeth. Its eyes were the blackest of black, and in the shape of a stretched-out rhombus. Large bat-like ears that were easily bigger than my hand flattened as it growled. The orb was attached to what looked like a thick, black sting, much like an anglerfish would have. "Hello, Iris," it spoke in a distorted, raspy, and deep voice of my mother. My blood flowed like rivers of ice as I stared in complete horror. The clouds moved past the moon and let light shine down on the creature. It was hunched down. It had long, slender arms with 4 fingers and long, scaly legs of a bird. The arms resembled that of a dinosaur, but longer. The underarms were decorated with long feathers. I screamed and back away quickly, only to get nudged by another one of those things. Clipping their beaks and teeth together, they kept nudging me back into a circle. I tripped over a rock and fell into the dirt and pine needles that dressed the grass, dropping my glow stick as I stared at them in what can only be described as pure terror. Then, the yellow-orbed one pounced, grabbing my left arm and yanking me upwards. The pain shot through me like electricity as I let out a blood-curdling scream. I felt my arm pop out of its socket as the bone-crushing strength of the mimic crashed down on my forearm, snapping it like a toothpick and causing me to flail and scream more. Another one latched onto my right leg and just went crazy, biting it and tearing at my flesh. This was a sign, the sign that the hungry-driven frenzy had begun. In a desperate attempt to get away, I yanked out my switchblade and slashed at the yellow-orbed mimic in the eye with it. The mimic I thought was the alpha. It screeched and let go of me. It dropped me roughly on the ground as it backed away and rubbed its face. My eyes narrowed, and I slashed at the one that leached off my right leg. It did the same thing, screeching and letting go of me as it rubbed its face and stamped its feet. The adrenaline pumped through my body again and numbed my pain, while shock also kicked in. On whatever was left of my right leg, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I heard a horrific screech and thunderous yet fast footsteps that soon followed after the battle cry. "Iris, come back. We only want to help you." "Iris," the leader screeched in that distorted voice of my mother. But I ran, not looking back at the things following me. I didn't notice how much blood I was losing, or how severe my injuries were. I just needed to run, to get away alive. I panted and stumbled my way through the threatening dark of the night, following the dirt path to salvation. I cried and screamed for help, even though no one was there to hear me. I heard chittering and footsteps next to me. Beside me was one of those mimics. It hissed and slammed into me, sending my poor body flying, crashing and skidding into the dirt. My brain felt like it'd just been made into a smoothie, as did my insides. I was dizzy, nauseous, and still high as hell on adrenaline. Panting and slowly standing up, the group circled me. Another one flicked its tail at me, strong, long, and muscular. Easily 16-ish pounds of pure muscle came crashing into my side and sent me flying into a tree. I grunted as I hit the tree and the ground soon afterwards. I felt my hands shaking as I attempted to stand up. My balance was unsteady, and my limbs were shaky. I heaved breaths through my tight chest as I stared at what I thought was my demise. The mimics growled and clipped their beaks together as they stared at me, seemingly waiting for the alpha's orders. With a hiss from the alpha, one of the subordinates lunged at me, swiping down on my body. Its claws snagged the flesh of my torso and essentially cut me open. I screamed and curled up from the sharp pain that came afterwards. I went in for another attack, but I used my switchblade to defend myself by slamming the blade into the roof of its mouth. It screeched and writhed as I held my hand there. A warm, dark liquid oozed onto my arm and hand, coating it with the stench of a familiar metallic smell of blood. The rest is a blur. I remember snippets of running through the woods on the moonlit night, a trip home gone wrong. My memory comes back to the bridge, an old wooden bridge suspended above a small creek. Rickety and worn down for the many years of being trotted and driven on. Around me were a few cop cars and an ambulance, the lights flashing blue and red over and over in my vision. I looked down to see myself covered in blood. My jacket and jeans were coated in large, dark, warm patches of what I assumed to be my blood. The adrenaline wore off and I collapsed in pain. It suddenly dawned on me that my left arm was completely useless. It was mangled beyond recognition, and I felt dizzy, probably from the blood loss. The medics scooped me into a stretcher and whisked me away to the hospital. My right arm clung to the switchblade. With the lights, I was able to see myself clearly, despite phasing in and out of consciousness. Blue. The blood was blue. It was the blood of those things, the mimics. I don't remember much of the ride in the ambulance besides weakly answering questions and having unfamiliar faces hover over me. Talking to each other in medical terms I didn't and still don't understand, as I watched them in vision that refused to focus on things. My family visited me, and the doctor said that my motor functions won't be the same, neither will my looks. Turns out my right leg was mangled, but salvageable. My left arm was broken and dislocated. I now have a scar running from under my left breast to my hip. It's light pink and jagged, like someone stretched out a long earthworm and laid it on my body. My skin was covered in battle scars from my struggle with the pack or flock or pod of those monsters, the mimics. Neurological damage was sustained to my arm and leg. So, I have a limp and damaged motor functions on top of everything. Plus medical bills, rent, no car, and everything else that comes along with it. Fired from my job due to scaring away the customers. There's now a strike happening, and employees are quitting in the masses. What a bittersweet, petty revenge. That encounter with the group of mimics damaged more than just my physical state. My mental state has rapidly rotted away, leaving me to decay and morph into this pathetically hollow shell of the woman I once was. What was most scary about the situation was not just the fact I was face to face with certain death. It was how they tracked and killed their prey. They knew your moves before you could make them. They read your mind and collected your memories. They manipulated their prey into following the lights on their head, and then they ate them. Tearing flesh and breaking bones, I was always worried that they would find me again to finish what they started. But they couldn't possibly follow me into the city, right? All the smells and all the sounds are different from their wooden home. All the loud noises and new smells would overwhelm them and disorient them. If they enter the city, they're either incredibly stupid or incredibly smart. I was wrong. Mauled bodies started popping up around the city. These corpses were so destroyed and messed up, it was hard to believe what those victims once looked like and who they once were. People who were once alive, breathing, moving, and speaking humans, were now getting reduced to nothing but a pile of destroyed organs, torn skin, splotches of blood, and shattered bone. Very much dead and nothing breathing nor moving. They were coming, hunting for me. They had tasted my flesh, my warm, soft meat. They wanted more. They wouldn't stop until they consumed every last morsel of flesh that clung to my bones. I'm not safe here, nor is everybody else that lives in the city. It won't be long before they find me. I endanger everyone here. Until I'm dead, they won't leave the city. I'm going insane and I know it. I can't sleep at night without having night terrors, without picturing their faces in my mind, without being drawn back to that night I almost died. I hate being alone, because being alone would mean that they would get me. It would mean I'm defenseless and would make for an easy picking. I'm moving to Los Angeles soon. My family members are pitching in to pay for it. Keegan and his wife will be joining me, to keep an eye on me and to cut expenses. Away from any forests and away from those fiends, those heathens. I can't help but blame myself these days. After all, it was my choice. All of this happened because I didn't want to sleep at my grandmother's house. For one night. Fleshgait. Written by Deleted User. Backstory. This happened a few years ago, when me and my friends were in our junior year of high school, around 2018. There is a Dow National Forest area northwest of our small western Colorado hometown that used to be Ute land before Meeker Massacre happened, and the natives were forced from their land. Being teenagers, we would frequent this area in our trucks to have bonfires, shoot targets, drink, smoke, fornicate, etc., without having to worry about law enforcement crashing our party. One night we were having a small bonfire with a group of 4 of my closest friends. Pretty quiet night. I had picked everyone up in my truck, so it was the only vehicle available, and the road to the clearing was a bit treacherous, so we had to be very careful to not get stuck in the mud or trees. Throughout the night, we kept hearing what sounded like some kind of owl, but almost like something impersonating an owl. On top of that, owls are fairly rare in this part of Colorado. It's a very dry climate, more home to vultures and mountain lions. We heard the noise around 5 times through a 1 hour span, and it quickly devolved from a hoo, hoo, to a singular hoo noise, similar to a gorilla sound. At this point we were concerned, and one of my buddies taunted whatever was making the noise by repeating it back into the tree line. At this point, the sound was immediately repeated, much closer than before, as if it was just behind the trees. We grabbed ourselves, and everyone scrambled into the truck. I hauled ass as much as possible back to the main road. The main road was still washboard gravel, so I tried my best to channel my inner rally car driver to get us the hell out of there. On the drive down the mountain, one of my friends was riding shotgun, and the rest were sitting in the bed facing backwards. As we rounded a curve, chaos ensued. I heard screaming from the bed of the truck, and my friend sitting shotgun nearly crapped herself about whatever the hell was happening back there. Instinctively, I slammed on the brakes and looked in the rear view. I didn't get a good look, but I can only describe it as a skinny, hairy humanoid creature with an arched back, sprinting across the road behind the truck on all fours. No coordination to its movements. It moved as if it was an old man, trying to bear crawl at a 2x speed video. I barely had time to process what I was looking at, before I was being screamed at to hit the gas. We finally got off the mountain, and my friends in the back of the truck appeared shell-shocked. I asked them if they saw what I saw, and they refused to answer, only saying, "Get us the freak out of here." It was only afterwards, when we were at our friend's house, when they felt comfortable enough about talking about what they saw, and only described it the same way. All fours, fast as hell, and humanoid. 2 of the 3 descriptions say that it had long creepy fingers. Eyes locked down the truck as it crossed the road. They say they saw trees and brush moving as we drove down, as if it was trying to catch up to us. 4 years later, and this story still makes my hair stand on end when I tell it. In addition, other weird things begin to happen in that forest after nightfall. We personally encounter a goat that had been killed by something, feet standing up in the air, stomach slashed in 6 equal cuts, and head nowhere to be found. I moved out of this town 3 years ago, but whenever I come to visit it creeps me out. I refuse to enter that area after dark, even towards sunset. Let me know what you guys think. A Fleshgait experience, submitted by Illegitimate Doctor. My family moved to rural Pennsylvania when I was 4. I was immediately entranced with living in the country, with several acres of woods behind us, and the house seemed huge to me at the time. However, as a kid I was always sensitive to spirits/energy, and there was definitely some creepy things going on in that house. So my parents noticed that I stayed with our dog Bambi a lot. He was a small sheepdog and my adventure buddy when we were out in the woods. In case you're questioning my parents, they trusted me, as young as age 7, to walk alone as long as I was with my dog, as he was very protective of me. My dad would also give me his cell phone to carry with me, in case I needed any help. Up until I was about 15, I spent a lot of time alone by choice. After school, I'd be home by 3:20 in grade school. I'd eat lunch and immediately take Bambi out into the woods, and we'd explore the surrounding forests, fields, and meadows and ponds together. He was always right by my side, and he always seemed attuned to spiritual stuff as well. If I felt something was in the house, he'd bark at it or whine, or I'd watch him follow it around. Usually, he'd pick up on the presence of something at the same time I would. Anyways, from the backyard to the left, there's a small strip of trees, and in the fall and winter, when the branches are bare, you can see the field next door, which is about 300 yards from my house itself. There's a big shed up there, and a kind of runway, where my neighbor would fly his biplanes off of. What's kind of important to the story is that I have no neighbors for a mile in every direction. It's pretty rare to see any kind of people on the surrounding properties, unless it's my neighbors haying the fields in the summer. But one day, in early fall, I've been tromping through the woods with Bambi for several hours. I let him run off the leash most of the time, but he would run only about 20 feet ahead, and keep turning around to check that I was still there. If I lost sight of him, he'd retrace his steps and find me again. That day, I got caught up whittling something, so Bambi ran off for a little bit, and I suddenly realized that I was alone. Suddenly, there was a lot of crashing deeper into the woods, and I heard Bambi's alarm bark and a lot of yelping and then some screeching. Raccoons and gophers make really scary distress sounds, so I figured that that's what it was. I called for Bambi, and he popped out of some brush covered in pickers, and since I was spooked, I ran back home with him. Right as I got to the back door, I stopped to catch my breath, and Bambi and I were just standing there, when I spotted something standing on the edge of the runway. It ran along the higher end of the field, and then there was a steep drop off the edge of the hill at the very end of it. They didn't appear to be wearing anything distinctive, but even in the dusk, I could still see that they appeared completely black, or everything about them was very shadowy and dark. This is the part that gives me shivers now. They were standing facing off of the runway, and then I saw them hunched over. Then, slowly raise their head and yell, "Bambi!" in the same high-pitched voice I used to call him. They had the same vocal inflection as me too, but it sounded like they were really trying hard to sound like me. Next to me, Bambi tucked her tail under, lowered his head, and growled softly. They called again, but this time it sounded like they were losing their voice, as if they'd been calling for a while now. In my 8-year-old logic, I assumed that someone was trying to steal my dog, but why would they stand in the middle of the field and be obvious about it? When I told my parents about that night, they just dismissed the story. The next day, I went to my cousin's house 2 miles up the road, and my uncle told me about an animal he saw the night before that he was trying to identify. He said it looked like an emaciated cow sprinting across the bridge over the creek, which is about 300 yards from the runway. And also since then, anyone who's been at my house has always been uneasy around the creek and the plane shed runway, whether or not they're interested at all in the paranormal. I know a lot of deaths that happened in nature, but I've also found several goats ripped up in the field. The nearest house with any amount of goats or farm animals is nearly 4 miles away, and a lot of unexplained things have happened there.